On an afternoon in 1943, a German sentry standing outside a supply depot on the edge of Harlem watched two girls come up the road on bicycles and did exactly what his training told him to do. Which was nothing. He had been taught to watch for men. Men in groups, men walking too fast, men who looked away when you looked at them. Nobody had written a paragraph in any manual about girls. The one in front had her hair in braids. The one behind her was laughing at something, and when they got close enough she asked him for a light, in the accent of a town he had learned to associate with fishing boats and bad weather. He gave her one. They stayed a while. That was the whole trick. Behind the building, while he was busy being charming, men from the Dutch resistance were walking into the depot with cans of petrol. By the time anyone smelled smoke, the girls were half a kilometer down the road, pedaling at the unhurried speed of two people who had nowhere in particular to be. The younger one was called Freddie Oversteegen. She was 17 that year. 2 years earlier, at 15, she had learned to load a pistol in a cellar used for storing potatoes. By the time she was 16, she had killed her first man. Nobody knows how many followed. Not because the records were lost, because she refused, for 73 years, to tell anyone. Journalists asked her in her 40s, in her 60s, in her 80s, sitting in an armchair with a blanket over her knees and a cup of coffee going cold beside her. The answer never changed, and it was always delivered in the same flat, faintly irritated tone, like a woman correcting a child who has asked how much money she has in the bank. You should never ask a soldier that. So this is a story with a hole in the middle of it. That hole is the point. Everything around it can be documented. The addresses, the dates, the names of the men who recruited her. The exact stretch of dune where her closest friend was shot 18 days before the war ended. But the number, the thing everyone wants, she took with her. Let's start where she started, which is nowhere near a pistol. Freddie Oversteegen was born in September 1925 in Schoten, a village that has since been swallowed by Harlem. Her sister Truus was 2 years older, born in 1923. Their childhood was poor in a way that was not unusual for the Netherlands in the 1920s and 1930s, but it was also unstable in a way that was. For a while, the family lived on a boat. Not a houseboat in the pleasant modern sense, with plants and a bicycle chained to the railing. A boat because a boat was cheaper than a house. Their father worked the water and did not do well at it, and money came in and went out, and eventually he came apart from their mother and left. The way he left stayed with Freddie her whole life. He stood at the bow of the boat as it pulled away and sang. In French. A song neither girl understood. Then he was smaller, and then he was gone, and then he was mostly gone from their lives altogether. That leaves Truus. Their mother is the person you need to understand if you want to understand the daughters, and almost every telling of this story rushes past her. Truus van der Molen was a communist in a country where that meant something concrete and unfashionable and occasionally dangerous even before the Germans arrived. She moved her two girls into a small flat in Harlem. They slept on mattresses stuffed with straw. There were stretches where dinner was an act of arithmetic. And into this flat, with no spare money and no spare space, she kept bringing people. Jewish families coming out of Germany, who had crossed the border with whatever they could carry and had nowhere to be. A Lithuanian couple who stayed and stayed. Political people who could not go home. Strangers who arrived after dark and were gone before the girls woke up, and whose names the girls were not told, because not knowing was a form of protection. Truus wrote later about a childhood in which the sound of the door meant somebody needed something, not once or twice, constantly. She and Freddie gave up their bed so often that it stopped feeling like a sacrifice and started feeling like the arrangement. Their mother had one rule, and she said it to them the way other parents say, wash your hands. If you want to help someone, you have to be willing to give something up yourself. Not your spare coins. Something that costs. This is the part people skip because it isn't dramatic. But you cannot make an assassin out of an ordinary teenager in 18 months. What you can do is raise a child in a house where the moral question was never open for debate, where hiding a family was simply what the flat was for, and then hand her a weapon when she is 15, and discover that the difficult work was done a decade earlier. The Germans came on the 10th of May, 1940. The Dutch army held for 5 days. Rotterdam was bombed flat on the 14th. The government fled to London. The Queen went with them, and the surrender was signed on the 15th. 5 days. A country that had stayed neutral through the entire First World War, that had built its self-image around being too sensible for other people's catastrophes, was occupied before the end of the month. Freddie was 14. Truus was 16. The occupation did not arrive all at once, which is what made it work. It arrived in installments, each one small enough to absorb. First, the uniforms in the street, which people got used to within a fortnight. Then the flags on the public buildings. Then the newspapers started printing things that were not quite lies, but were no longer news. Then the registrations. Jewish citizens were counted, then catalogued, then stripped of their jobs, then barred from the parks and the trams and the cinemas, then made to wear a yellow star, then moved, then taken. Each step was announced in a bulletin, in the reasonable language of administration, and each step made the next one look like a small adjustment to something that already existed. The Netherlands ended up losing around 3/4 of its Jewish population, roughly 102,000 people. It is the worst figure in Western Europe, and one of the reasons is that the Dutch civil service was excellent. The country had superb population records. Clean, cross-referenced, accurate, kept by decent men who had built them for census purposes and never imagined what they would one day be used for. Freddie remembered the nights. Not the daytime, the nights. The particular sound of a rifle butt hitting a wooden door, which is a sound you only need to hear once to recognize forever. Shouting on the stairwell, furniture going over. A family being walked out of a building at 2 a.m. while every window on the street stayed dark. Because behind every one of those windows was somebody who had decided, quite reasonably, that this was not survivable, and that the safest thing was to be asleep. Most of the country made that decision. It is worth saying plainly, without contempt. 9 million people, an occupying army, a functioning police force that had been folded into the occupation, and a flat landscape with no mountains, no forests worth the name, and no border you could reach that wasn't also occupied. The Netherlands had no Maquis because it had nowhere to put one. The Oversteegens made the other decision, and they made it early. It began with paper. The first illegal newspapers were being typed and mimeographed within weeks of the surrender, and somebody had to carry them, and 2 schoolgirls with a satchel were about the safest delivery mechanism available. Then pamphlets. Then the posters. Picture the logistics for a second, because they are more interesting than they sound. A German propaganda poster goes up on a wall. Sometime after curfew, 2 girls cycle down the street with a tin of paste and a roll of paper, and one holds the bicycle while the other slaps a resistance sheet over the top of it. "Go and work in Germany," says the poster underneath. "Don't," says the one on top. "It takes maybe 40 seconds. If a patrol comes past, they are 2 sisters out too late, embarrassed, apologetic, useless. They got very good at useless. It was the beginning of a professional skill. Word about that flat traveled, the way it does. In 1941, a man called Frans van der Wiel came to the door. He was building the Haarlem cell of what became the Raad van Verzet, the Council of Resistance, and he had heard about the mother who hid people and the 2 daughters who moved around the city without anyone thinking twice. He asked whether the girls could do more than deliver newspapers. He asked their mother, which tells you something about the period. Freddie was 15 and Truus was 17. And this was a conversation about whether her children could be trained to kill people, held in a kitchen, in a language of extreme politeness. Treintje said yes. She did not ask for time to think about it. She had spent 10 years teaching them that helping people costs something, and this was the bill. Then came the test, and the test is the part of this story I keep turning over. A few days later, a man forced his way into the flat shouting in German, "Gestapo, He wanted the Jewish man he had been told was hiding there. He shoved past the girls. He searched. He threatened. He got in their faces and demanded a name and an address. They gave him nothing. Truus went at him physically. Freddie, 15 years old, did not fold, did not cry, did not bargain. They believed he was real. That is the whole design of it. He was a resistance man in a borrowed coat, and the point was never to see whether they could keep a secret under pressure. It was to see what they did in the first 4 seconds, before there was time to be brave on purpose. He dropped the act and told them they had passed. I do not know what a 15-year-old is supposed to feel at that moment. Relief, presumably. Then, about a second later, the understanding that she had just been recruited. He laid out what was coming. Sabotage first. Explosives. And at the end of it, if they got that far, weapons. Their mother said one more thing to them before they went. It has been repeated in every account of their lives, sometimes as a slogan, which is a shame, because it wasn't one. It was an instruction from a woman who understood exactly what she was signing her daughters up for and was trying to give them something to hold on to on the way back. Whatever happens, stay human. Truus put it in the title of her memoir decades later. Freddie repeated it to interviewers when she was 88 years old and could no longer remember the names of some of the men she had shot. It was the last thing either of them let go of. The training happened underground, in the most Dutch location imaginable, a cellar used for storing potatoes. Down there, in bad light, with the sound deadened by earth and sacking, 2 teenage girls were taught how to hold a pistol so the recoil didn't take the barrel off target, how to breathe, how to squeeze rather than pull, how to carry a weapon under a coat so the outline doesn't show, which is a different skill from shooting, and in their line of work, a more important one. They were also taught the thing that is hardest to teach, which is speed, not accuracy. In the work they were about to do, the range was almost never more than a few meters. What mattered was the interval between deciding and doing, and the interval had to be 0, because at 3 meters, a man who sees you reach for your coat has time to reach for his. Freddie was small. She looked younger than she was, and she knew it, and she used it for the next 4 years like a piece of equipment. The first jobs were the depot jobs. 2 girls, a sentry, a conversation. Sometimes a cigarette, sometimes a request for directions, sometimes flirting, which both sisters described later in the same clipped way, as a task rather than a memory. Meanwhile, men were going in the back with fuel. It worked over and over again, and it kept working, and that fact is worth sitting with. These were not stupid men. They were soldiers in an occupied city where sabotage happened every week. But a 19-year-old conscript from Bavaria standing in the rain outside a warehouse in a country where nobody would speak to him is going to talk to the girl who smiles at him. Every time. The Germans never wrote a countermeasure for that because they never quite believed in the threat. The sisters also did the ordinary, less cinematic work, which took up more of their time than anything else. They moved Jewish children. They carried papers. They ferried weapons between cells and bicycle bags with vegetables on top. Freddie once described cycling with a Jewish toddler on the back of her bike, and the child being frightened, and having to sing to it the whole way to stop it crying, because a crying child makes people look. Then the assignments changed. There is no moment in the record where somebody says, "Today we begin killing people." It happened the way most escalations happen, in small procedural steps that each looked like the obvious next thing. The resistance had an intelligence problem and no solution to it. A collaborator identifies a hiding place. 12 people are taken from an attic on Thursday. By Sunday, they are on a train. There is no court to go to, because the courts now work for the occupation. There is no police station, because the police carry out the arrests. There is no prison to put the man in, and no way to feed him if there were. You can warn him. Some cells tried that. He tells his handler, and now the cell is finished. So there was one remaining option, and everyone involved understood exactly what it was, and the euphemism they used in Dutch was liquidatie, liquidation. The word does some work. It puts the act in the same grammatical family as clearing a debt. Targets came down as a package, a name, an address, a pattern of movement. This cafe on Tuesdays, this tram at this hour, walks his dog at 9. Sometimes a photograph, more often a description, because photographs were dangerous to carry. Freddie's job at first was reconnaissance. She was the one who walked the route. She would spend days on a street learning where the shadows fell in the evening, which alley connected to which courtyard, where a bicycle could be left without anyone moving it, how long it took to get from the point of contact to a road with 3 exits. She was 17, and she was doing route analysis, and she was doing it well enough that the cell kept using her. Truus was the decisive one. Every person who knew both sisters says the same thing in slightly different words. Truus argued, Truus pushed, Truus made the call. Freddie planned, and worried, and remembered. The methods they developed were built entirely around one asset, which was that nobody was afraid of them. The first was the walk. One of them would go into a bar or a cafe in Harlem where German officers drank off duty. She would sit near and be young and be interested and let a conversation happen. Truus was very good at this and said afterwards that the worst part was not the end of it, but the middle. The 40 minutes of pretending, of laughing at a man's story about his brother, of watching him relax into the idea that he had met a nice girl in a hard posting. Then, would you like to go for a walk? It's stuffy in here. Out of town, towards the trees. There were woods on the edges of Harlem and dunes past those, and it was quiet, and it was dark early for half the year. The other sister was already there. Truus described the shooting as the easy part, and then spent the rest of her life demonstrating that this was not true. She said in one interview that she had asked a man, on such a walk, whether he had children, and that he had said yes, and shown her, and that she had gone through with it anyway, and that she was not going to explain herself to anyone about it. The second method was the bicycle. One sister pedaling, the other sitting side saddle on the rack behind, coat over the pistol. You come up the street at the speed of ordinary traffic, you pass the target on the pavement, the passenger fires at a range of 2 or 3 meters, and the bicycle does not stop or accelerate, it just keeps going. Because a bicycle that keeps going is not a bicycle anyone remembers. Freddie shot at least one man that way, riding past on an ordinary street on an ordinary evening, and said afterwards that the strange thing was how little it changed the street. People kept walking. It took a few seconds for anyone to understand what the noise had been. By then, the girls were around the corner. The third method was the door. Follow him home over a week, confirm the address, confirm who else lives there, confirm the hours. Knock. He opens it, because a girl on a doorstep at 7 in the evening is a neighbor's daughter, or a message, or a mistake. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story gets told badly. It gets told as a sequence of cool operations. It was not cool. Freddie was 17. She had a curfew violation to worry about on the way home. She was, by her own account, sick afterwards, repeatedly, and she was the one who could not sleep, and she went back to a flat where her mother would be waiting up and would ask nothing at all. She said, decades later, in a sentence that gets quoted less than it should be, that she had held a man while he died, and that he had gone very quiet, and that this was worse than the shooting had been. Then she said, it was not nice. Not nice at all. And she moved on to the next question. In 1943, a third woman joined them, and she is the one the Netherlands remembers. Hannie Schaft was born Jannetje Johanna Schaft in Harlem in 1920, which made her about 5 years older than Freddie. Her father was a school teacher. She was an only surviving child, badly overprotected after her sister died young, and she went to Amsterdam to read law with the specific intention of working in human rights. In 1943, the occupation authorities required university students to sign a declaration of loyalty. Sign, and you carry on with your degree. Refuse, and you are out, and probably headed for a labor draft. Something like 85% of Dutch students signed. It was, by any sane calculation, the correct decision. There was no benefit to refusing except the refusal itself. Hannie refused. She left Amsterdam, went home, and joined the resistance instead. She had been doing quiet work already, forging identity papers, mostly for Jewish friends, but the armed cell was a different proposition, and they tested her the way they tested everybody. She was handed a pistol and sent to shoot a man. They told her was a German officer. She went. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger, and nothing happened, because the pistol was empty, and the man was one of theirs. She had not hesitated. She was in. She had bright red hair, which in that line of work is a catastrophic liability, and she knew it, and it eventually killed her. She dyed it black and wore glasses she did not need. But the descriptions circulating among the German security services and the Dutch police already had a phrase attached to them, and the phrase spread, and it followed her. The girl with the red hair. The three of them worked together for about 2 years. In the accounts left by the sisters, Hannie was the strategist, the one who thought a plan through to the third consequence. Truus was the will. Freddie was the eyes. And what they actually did in those 2 years was mostly not shooting. They cut rail lines, which is unglamorous work involving cold hands and a long walk home. They blew a section of track to interfere with deportation transports. They moved children out of Amsterdam to families in the north. They carried papers and forged papers and burned papers. Somebody in that cell spent a lot of evenings with a pot of paste and a stack of counterfeit ration books, and the reason you have never heard about it is that nobody makes a film about a ration book. But the liquidations continued, and by 1944, most of the names on the lists were Dutch. That surprises people. It shouldn't. A German officer in Haarlem could not tell you which house on the Kleine Houtweg had an extra family in the roof. A Dutch collaborator could. He had grown up there. He knew who had bought more bread than a household that size should need. He knew which curtains had started closing at odd hours. The German occupation could not have functioned for 5 years on its own manpower, and it did not have to. Truus used a word for these men that is ugly, and that she never softened. She called them a tumor in the body of the country, something that had to be cut out because there was no other treatment available. Freddie was less rhetorical about it. She said they were doing a job that somebody had to do, and that she did not expect anyone to admire her for it. And then there is the assignment they refused, which matters more than anything else in this story. At some point, the leadership floated a plan involving Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian lawyer who ran the occupied Netherlands as Reich Commissioner and who was hanged at Nuremberg for it. He had children. The proposal was to take them and hold them, to trade against the resistance prisoners sitting in cells waiting to be shot. If the trade failed, the logic of the plan did not have a merciful ending, and everyone in the room knew it. Freddie, Truus, and Hannie said no. Not on tactical grounds. On the only grounds that were left. They had shot men in woods and on pavements and in doorways, and they were not going to be talked into this, and Freddie explained it afterwards in about 8 words. They were fighting the Nazis. They were not going to become them. I think that refusal is the reason this story is worth telling at all. Because a teenage girl who kills people is a curiosity, and there were more of them in that war than most people realize. A teenage girl who kills people and holds a line while doing it, and can tell you precisely where the line is something else. The line was tested from the other direction too. Truus told a story for the rest of her life that she never varied and never enjoyed telling. She was on a street in Haarlem, off duty, no operation, no orders. A Dutch SS man was manhandling a family. According to her account, he took the baby and killed it in front of the parents, on the pavement, in daylight. She shot him where he stood. That was not sanctioned. There was no cell decision, no route planned, no bicycle waiting. It was a 17-year-old girl watching something and deciding, in the space of a breath, that the man was not going to walk away from it. She said she never lost a night's sleep over that particular one. Given everything else she did lose sleep over, I believe her. By 1944, Hannie Schaft had become a problem the occupation authorities were spending real money to solve. The reports kept describing the same person. A young woman, small, involved in shootings in and around Harlem. Red hair in the earlier descriptions, which she had already dealt with. There were rewards. There were photographs circulating among the Dutch police, some of them accurate. In June 1944, she went out on an operation with another resistance member to kill a collaborator, and it went wrong in the way these things generally went wrong, which is that the target was not alone. There was shooting. Her partner was hit and taken. He ended up in a hospital bed under guard, badly wounded, and the interrogation that followed was not the kind with a bright lamp. It was quieter and much more effective. Men sat with him and were kind to him and told him things that were not true and let him believe he was talking to people who were on his side, and he gave up enough. Enough led them to Hannie's parents. Her mother and father were arrested and sent to a camp. They survived, which is not something you could have bet on. Hannie went deep into hiding and effectively stopped operating for months, not out of fear for herself, but because she had become a thread that other people were hanging from. And the discipline of that period was that you removed yourself before you took anybody down with you. She came back to work in 1945, in the last winter, which in the Netherlands has a name of its own. The Honger Winter. The Hunger Winter. The railways had struck in support of the Allied advance. The Germans cut off food transport to the west in reprisal, and then the canals froze. People in Amsterdam and Haarlem ate tulip bulbs and sugar beets. Somewhere between 18 and 22,000 died of starvation in a developed European country in the year the war was already lost. The resistance kept working through it, on those rations, in that cold. On the 21st of March, 1945, Hannie Schaft cycled through Haarlem carrying a stack of illegal newspapers and a pistol. There was a checkpoint. It was routine. That is the detail that has always stayed with me. That after 4 years of forged papers and dyed hair and calculated risk, she was stopped by 2 men doing an ordinary spot check, and they found the newspapers, and then they found the gun. She was taken to the prison on the Amstelveense in Amsterdam. She was beaten. She was held in isolation. They knew they had somebody, because of the pistol, but for a while they did not know who. Then somebody noticed her hair. She had kept dyeing it, but she had been in a cell for weeks by then, and dye grows out. The roots were red. Somebody put that next to a description that had been circulating for a year and a half, and the questioning changed. She admitted her part in the shootings. She did not deny anything she had done. She gave up no one. Not Truus, not Freddie, not the cell, not a single street name. This is worth stating plainly because it is the thing that decided whether the other 2 women in this story got to live. Everything you have just heard about Freddie Oversteegen exists only because a 24-year-old law student kept her mouth shut in a cell in Amsterdam while people hit her. On the 17th of April, 1945, she was driven out to the dunes near Overveen, which is a stretch of gray-green sand and marram grass a few kilometers from where she was born. It was already a killing ground. Hundreds of people had been shot and buried there over the preceding years. 2 men were assigned to do it. One of them fired first and hit her, but did not kill her. What she said next has been repeated so often in the Netherlands that it has taken on the smoothness of legend, and I have no way to verify it, and I am going to repeat it anyway, because it was reported by the men who were there. Wounded, on the ground, she is supposed to have said that she was the better shot. The second man made sure. She was 24. She was buried in the sand where she fell. 18 days later, on the 5th of May, the German forces in the Netherlands surrendered. 18 days. The war in the Netherlands ended the way a fever breaks. Canadian troops came down roads lined with people who had been eating flower bulbs a fortnight earlier. Flags nobody had been allowed to own came out of hiding places. And then, almost immediately, the practical work began, and part of that work was the dunes. They started digging at Overveen in the summer of 1945. Over the following months, investigators recovered more than 400 bodies from that stretch of coast. Men, almost entirely. Resistance workers, hostages, prisoners taken from cells and driven out at dawn and shot in batches. Among the 400, there was one woman. She was identified, and the country did something for her that it did for almost nobody else. On the 27th of November, 1945, Hannie Schaft was reburied at the honorary cemetery in the dunes, at a state funeral, with Queen Wilhelmina in attendance, who called her the symbol of the resistance. A novel was written about her. Then a film. Streets, schools, a foundation, an annual commemoration that still happens every November. That is what identification can do. It turns a body in a dune into a person with a name, and a name into a grave someone can visit. Most of the men in that sand were identified by paperwork, a prison intake card, a transport list, a line in a register kept by a clerk who never knew any of them. It is strange work, and it is how most families in every country got their answers after that war, from files rather than from witnesses. If your own family has an unfinished version of that, an American serviceman nobody talks about, a photograph with no date, a drawer of medals and patches and folded documents that nobody ever explained, there is a way to reconstruct what he did from almost nothing. I wrote a book about exactly that. It's called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it's linked in the description below. Then back to Haarlem, where two sisters were about to be quietly forgotten. Because none of that recognition went to the Oversteegens. This is the part of the story I find genuinely hard to be calm about. Freddie and Truus survived. They were 20 and 22 years old at the end of the war. They had done as much as anyone in that region had done, and the country that gave Hannie Schaft a state funeral gave them almost nothing for the next 70 years. The reason is not complicated, and it is not honorable. It was the Cold War. The Dutch Communist Party had been disproportionately represented in the armed resistance, for the straightforward reason that communists had been fighting fascists in Europe since the early 30s, and had the organizational habits for underground work. The Oversteegen family was part of that world. Their mother had raised them in it. By 1948, that had become an inconvenient thing to have been. The commemorations of Hannie Schaft, who had been close to the communist resistance herself, were seen as a political liability, and in 1951, the Dutch government actually banned the annual Hannie Schaft Memorial March. Police were deployed to stop it. Tanks were in the streets in Haarlem to prevent a group of people, many of them women in their 20s who had done the work, from laying flowers on the grave of a girl who had been shot in a dune 6 years earlier. Truus was there. So was Freddie. That is the atmosphere in which these two women went back to ordinary life, and it explains why the standard version of Dutch wartime memory has room for one red-haired law student, and no room at all for the two sisters who trained in the potato cellar. They handled it differently, as siblings do. Truus became an artist. She sculpted, she painted, she made memorials, and she talked. She talked for 50 years, to schools, to journalists, to anyone who asked, and quite a few people who hadn't. She wrote a memoir and gave it the title her mother had given her. Not then, not now, not ever. She turned the whole thing into a public argument, which was probably the only way she could carry it. Freddie went silent and went domestic. She married Jan Dekker. She had 3 children. She kept a house. From the outside, for decades, she was an ordinary woman in the Dutch suburbs with an ordinary marriage and an ordinary garden. And if you had met her at a school gate in 1958, you would have learned nothing. Inside, it did not go well, and she was honest about that late in life in a way that I think took more nerve than the shooting did. She did not sleep properly. She had nightmares for decades. Certain sounds were bad. The 4th of May, the Dutch National Day of Remembrance, was an annual reopening of everything, and she went to the ceremonies anyway, every year, and stood there while the country was silent for 2 minutes about a war it had decided to remember selectively. She told an interviewer that she had never got used to it, that she had cried often over what she had done and over what had happened to Hannie, and that crying about it was not the same as regretting it. She was very clear on that distinction. She never once said she was sorry that she had fought. She also never once said it had been worth doing lightly, and she kept going back to the dunes. Every year, and sometimes more often, Freddie Oversteegen went out to the honorary cemetery at Bloemendaal to Hannie's grave, and she brought red roses, and she did this for over 70 years, well into her 90s, until she couldn't get there under her own power anymore. Recognition finally arrived in 2014, which is a number I would like you to sit with for a second. 69 years. Prime Minister Mark Rutte awarded both sisters the Mobilization War Cross. Truus was 91. Freddie was 89. Their families had been pushing for it for years, and when it came with the slightly embarrassed energy of a country handing over something it should have handed over when the recipients were young enough to enjoy it. Freddie's reaction to the ceremony was characteristically unimpressed. She had spent 7 decades being told her family's politics made her contribution awkward, and a medal in her late 80s did not fix that. But she took it. And after that, the interviews started, and the documentaries, and the foreign press discovered her, and for the last 4 years of her life she was, improbably, famous. She was not comfortable with the version of herself that came back through the media. The teenage assassin. The girl with the pistol in the bicycle basket. She kept correcting people, and the correction was always in the same direction, away from the glamour and towards the cost. Truus died on the 18th of June 2016. She was 92. Freddie died on the 5th of September 2018, 1 day short of her 93rd birthday. She had a heart attack in a care home. She had outlived her sister by 2 years, her closest friend by 73, and the war itself by longer than most people live. So what do you do with a story like this? There is a temptation to smooth it, and I have watched a lot of people do it. Turn her into a folk hero with braids and a bicycle, put a swelling score under it, and you get something very shareable and completely false. She wasn't a folk hero. She was a 15-year-old girl who was handed a gun by adults who should probably have thought harder about it, in a country that had run out of other options, and she did things that she then had to carry for 3/4 of a century in a quiet house in the suburbs, with her children asleep upstairs. There is an opposite temptation, which is to get squeamish about it and start reaching for phrases like moral complexity. I have less patience with that one. The men she shot were not ambiguous. They were people who identified hiding places and handed families to a system with a known and industrial destination. There were no courts. There was no prison. There was no other mechanism. You can call what the resistance did extrajudicial killing, and it was, and I would like to hear the alternative proposal for the summer of 1944 in Haarlem. What separates her from the machinery she was fighting is not the killing. It is everything around the killing. The Nazis built a system precisely so that no individual would ever have to decide. There were quotas, timetables, requisition forms, and rolling stock. A man could spend the entire war signing transport schedules and never look at a face, and that was the design, not a flaw in it. Freddie and Truus had none of that. Every single name came to them one at a time. They looked at each one. They walked behind the man for a week. They knew what he had for lunch. And then they had to choose, individually, every time, knowing exactly what the choice meant, and then go home and eat dinner with their mother. And when the choice was one they could not live with, they said no. Cees Inquart's children were available. Kidnapping them was operationally realistic. They refused and lost nothing by refusing except the operation, and that refusal is the clearest thing in the entire record about who they actually were. The number never came out. Estimates run into the dozens, some say considerably more, and every one of those figures is somebody's guess. She never confirmed a single one of them. She never denied one either, which is its own kind of answer. She just held the line for 73 years with the same sentence, delivered with the same slight impatience. You should never ask a soldier that. I have thought about why that answer is the right one, and I have landed somewhere I did not expect. It isn't modesty, and it isn't trauma, or not only. A number would let you file her. 6 and she's a footnote. 60 and she's a monster or a legend, depending on the music. Either way, you'd get to stop looking at her and start looking at a figure. By refusing to give it, she made everyone deal with the actual person, which is much harder and much less satisfying. Here is the image I keep, and it is not the one from the beginning of this video. It is not the girl on the bicycle in 1943 with a pistol under her coat. It is a woman in her 80s, walking slowly across a cemetery in the dunes outside Harlem, with red roses in her hand, going to see a friend who has been 24 years old since 1945. She did that for 73 years. She never explained it to anyone. She never asked to be understood. Her mother told her, when she was 15 years old and about to go down into a cellar to learn how to shoot, "Whatever they make you do, stay human." As far as I can tell, she managed it, which is more than can be said for almost everybody else who was armed in Europe between 1940 and 1945.